Thank you very much, Nimrod. I'd like to thank all the dear participants and guests. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, in the brief time I have, I'll try to address several points. First of all, with respect to the Emirates and the new agreements with the Arab countries, and on the Palestinian issue, I'll also talk about Europe and the US. As for the new accords, we're talking about the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. I need to make a point clear. In contrast to various rumors or claims, we support these agreements. We think that these agreements are important and we support them. And yet, this argument of the government and of the Israeli right that these accords seal and completely finish off the Palestinian issue, I think it's a lie, it's deceitful, and it undermines Israeli interest. It's not true, because the condition for the accords with the UAE was the cancellation of the annexation, and of course there were also the planes, the airplane transaction in the case of Sudan, to take them off the blacklist of terror-supporting countries, etc. But the Palestinian issue was definitely part of it. So first of all, that's a lie. And the second point, you know, the fact that the undermining of Israeli interests, we don't think that progress in the negotiations with the Palestinian is some kind of a favor that we do for the Palestinians, but I believe it to be an essential Israeli interest so we can live in peace and security here in our country in a Jewish and democratic state. Therefore, all this charade or the way they use these new accords in order to cancel, to protest, to take off the table the Palestinian issue is misleading, it's harmful, and we say that this is our position. We support the accords and normalization of Israel with every country in the region. We think that what's even more important is that we make progress with the Palestinians, our neighbors, with whom we share this land, and we should do it based on a two-state solution. Ultimately, even the Trump plan, the plan of the century, which I wasn't a great advocate of, even that plan talks about a Palestinian state in the majority of the territory, and I believe that this is where we need to strive towards for the implementation of the two-state solution. I would prefer to see the new accords with the Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, maybe there will be others, as a means to maybe make this, to facilitate this and to enable progress. I definitely don't accept this claim or this formula. It's as if Netanyahu has proven that we don't need the Palestinians. What do you mean you don't need the Palestinians? We need the Palestinians. They are our neighbors. They are right over here, and they are the ones we need to reach an agreement with, and that is our position, and it's a very clear one. As for Europe, I'd like to say something about what I define as a progressive approach to Israeli foreign policy. In recent years, and because of Netanyahu and because of other developments in the world, for example, Trump and other governments, other prime ministers and presidents in Europe and in South America, we see the rise of reactionary, anti-democratic, anti-liberal governments. And it is with these governments, these leaders, that Israel is deepening its relations, and it does so, regretfully, at the expense of its relationship with democratic, liberal countries. And ultimately, the most basic interest of Israel, let's say with respect to Europe, is to have a very profound alliance with these democratic countries that have always stood by us, and they have always been our true allies, whether it is France or Germany, for example. And this axis that has been formed with countries that have a very clear anti-democratic policy, for example, Poland, Hungary, other countries in Eastern Europe, perhaps, it is necessary to have an alliance with them. I'm not naive. I know that most countries in the world don't have a democratic regime, but as far as Israel's interest is concerned, Israel definitely needs to invest great efforts, great resources in order to maintain the relationship. And this idea that we've witnessed for several years now, that the EU is a hostile entity, that they are anti-Israeli, that they are enemy, that the socialist parties in Europe are hostile towards Israel, are Israel rivals simply because they support a two-state solution. I believe that this is a completely flawed and mistaken idea. I understand why it is taking hold, and it does serve internal domestic goals both there and here. But if we look at the Israeli interest, we have nothing to look for in these countries. And it's important to understand that Israel is essentially a democratic country. If we decide that we are no longer part of the democratic family, then we can search our luck elsewhere. But our democratic essence does not allow us to distance ourselves in such a manner from countries, from governments that are democratic and liberal. And once again, I give the example of Germany and France and the EU as an organization. When I hear the way the Israeli right talks about them, I am quite shocked and appalled at times. And this takes me to the most prominent example that has other aspects, and that is the Democratic Party in the US. I'm not saying this just because maybe, and I hope I'm not hiding this. You know what my views are. I do hope that Joe Biden will win these elections. But even if we weren't talking about elections, if this weren't election time, because this is something I said 2 and 3 years ago, and even during the time of Obama, Netanyahu's policy to put all the Israeli eggs in the Republican basket to create a severe rift, a severe schism with the Democratic Party in the US, it's completely erroneous with respect to the interest of Israeli policy. And we're talking now from the perspective of Israeli foreign policy. Israel's asset has always been that Israel was a matter of bipartisan consensus in the US. It went across the aisle, as they say. Both Democrats and Republicans supported Israel, and now it has been broken in recent years, and the Israeli government and Netanyahu has a key role in this trend. And here we can talk about something else, and that is the Jewish issue in the US. And maybe not all Israelis are aware of that. Maybe others prefer to ignore this. There is a very high correlation in the US between the Jewish community and voting for the Democratic Party. And of course, that's not new. This has been the case since the beginning of the 20th century, since masses of Jews immigrated to the US. In every presidential election conducted in the US since the beginning of the 20th century, a vast majority of American Jews voted for the Democratic Party. And that is not going to change as well. It has to do with all kind of deep reasons. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a basic fact. The fact that the Israeli government is spitting in the face of the Democratic Party, is spitting in the face of the Jewish community's political affiliation with the Democratic Party, is boycotting organizations like J Street, progressive organizations, Tikkun Olam organizations, peace-promoting organizations of the Jewish community in the US identified with the American liberal left. This is causing great damage to the Israeli interest. I think it's the wrong thing to do anyhow, and it is misguided, but I'm now focusing on Israel's interest. But I have to say that this simply is a deed that cannot be done. And Netanyahu could ostensibly say, well, you know what, I succeeded. Look how many things Trump did for Israel. But this could all change next week. And then what? And then what? I don't want to reach a situation in which Israel will experience a schism, a rift with the US. I think it's destructive, it's intolerable, it's harmful, and I think that a vast majority, a huge majority of Israelis won't accept that, and neither will most American, or rather American Jews. And we need to take a sober, logical, normal approach. We must look at the share with we must look at our shared values. We must look at our interests, the vast Jewish community in the US and what it feels. It's such an immense support for the state of Israel. It is the foundation of Zionism. We need to look at our political and security interests. We need to look at everything that's happening, and we must understand what a grave mistake it was to sever the relations with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, if anybody would have told me 10 years ago that a right-wing party, a right-wing government in Israel would sever their relations with the Democratic Party, I would say that that person is insane, because even the Israeli right understood that we mustn't do that. But this has happened in recent years, and there's a major crisis, and we need to fix that. And to conclude, I think that the state of Israel, once again, we do have realpolitik issues. There are agreements. There are countries in the world. There are tyrannic countries in the world. I understand that. I'm not ignoring that. This is the world that we live in. I don't think we need to be so enthusiastic about our relations with some kind of very strange leaders in the world. And ultimately, our place, and this is something that most Israeli citizens will agree on, we belong to the enlightened world. We belong to the liberal democratic world, a world that defends human rights, that protects civilian equality, and tries to resolve conflicts in peaceful ways. I have no illusions that if this current government in Israel will continue, this policy will change, because the policy won't change as long as Netanyahu is in office, because that's his declared policy. But I do hope that if there is a change, and it will be a dramatic change in the US, if we will see a change of administration next week, I hope this will lead the government in Jerusalem to revisit, to rethink the directions of its foreign policy. I hope that they will understand that we cannot behave as if we were an extreme right-wing country. Maybe we are. Indeed, we have an extreme right-wing government. I'm sorry to say that, but even that government has enough sane people. At least I'm talking about the people from Kahol Lavan, from blue and white, and they must understand that they have nothing to look for over there. Yes, they need to maintain a relationship, and it's important to have a relationship with countries that perhaps are not that nice, but the affiliation, the proximity, that's what we have with the democratic and liberal world, and this is where we must be.